Somewhere in your family, there is probably a man who came home from the Pacific and never talked about it. He sat in a chair on Sunday afternoons, watched the game, drank one beer, and changed the subject when anyone asked. This is the story of one of the nights that explains why. If you're old enough to remember Walter Cronkite reading the evening news, you're old enough to remember a time when every American on this continent knew the word Guadalcanal. It was the front page of every newspaper in the fall of 1942, the word in the newsreels before the picture started, the word your mother whispered when a War Department letter reached the house down the block. Most Americans today couldn't find it on a map. But 83 years ago, on a Friday morning in August 1942, on a strip of white sand at the mouth of a stagnant creek on that island's northern shore, a 21-year-old from Philadelphia held the trigger of a machine gun down until the barrel glowed red in his hands. Within 4 hours, he would be blind for the rest of his life. Within 4 hours, more than 200 Japanese soldiers would lie dead in front of his gun, part of nearly 800 who would die on that sandbar before the sun came up. And the Marines fighting beside him, boys of 19, 20, 21, did something in the dark that has been misunderstood for most of the 80 years since. They let the enemy come. They watched him cross the sand. They did not fire. Not at 100 meters, not at 50, not at 40. This was not panic, and it was not a mistake. It was fire discipline, a piece of arithmetic passed down from the trench lines of 1918, drilled into every American infantry officer since. At close range, on ground the enemy has to funnel through, patience is not cowardice, because every meter he closes is a meter he can no longer retreat across. It was the reason a battle nobody in America remembers today became the moment the Pacific War started to turn. The time is roughly 3:10 in the morning, August 21st, 1942. Some 200 Japanese soldiers are running across a strip of sand no wider than a suburban driveway, running in near silence, boots barely touching the ground, bayonets catching the last green light of a dying flare. They are the advance element of the 28th Infantry Regiment, elite light infantry with a fighting record stretching back to the opening days of the war in China, and they are closing on the American line, 100 meters, 90, 80, 50. On the far bank, behind sandbags and coconut logs and cut palm fronds, American machine guns are already loaded, young men already lying behind them, cheeks against wooden stocks, fingers inside the trigger guards. Not one of them fires. At 30 meters, the Marines can hear sand shifting under Japanese boots. They can hear breathing. Still, nobody fires. To understand why, you have to go back 2 weeks, to a morning when 11,000 young Americans woke up on the deck of a troop transport and looked out at an island almost none of them had heard of. That morning was August 7th, 1942. The island, a green, mountainous scar of jungle in the southeastern Solomons, had been named by Spanish explorers 4 centuries earlier for a village in Andalusia, and it mattered now for one reason. Japanese naval construction crews had spent weeks carving an airstrip out of the coastal plain at Lunga Point, and once finished, land-based bombers flying from it could reach the sea lanes between the United States and Australia and cut them. The airfield had to be taken, and it had to be taken now. The 1st Marine Division came ashore that morning under Major General Alexander Archer Vandegrift, 55, Virginia-born, a career officer who had spent his service in the small wars of the Caribbean, Nicaragua, Haiti, chasing guerrillas rather than commanding massed formations, and who had never before commanded a division in combat, a description that fit most of his officers and nearly all of his men. Operation Watchtower, the code name for the whole Guadalcanal landing, had been assembled so hastily that Marines and sailors involved in the planning privately called it Operation Shoestring, a joke about how thin the actual logistics and intelligence supporting it really were. The average Marine in that division was 19 years old. Some were 17 and had lied about it. Almost none had ever fired a rifle at another human being. They met no resistance. The Japanese construction crews fled into the jungle, and the unfinished airstrip, renamed Henderson Field after a pilot killed 2 months earlier at Midway, fell into American hands within 36 hours. The Marines dug a defensive perimeter roughly 3 miles long and 2 deep around it, and settled in to wait. They did not wait long, and here is where the story usually told about that night leaves something important out. 2,500 miles north, at the Japanese naval base on Truk, a 50-year-old army colonel named Kiyonao Ichiki was reading a cable that had just arrived from Rabaul. Ichiki was no amateur, a graduate of the Imperial Army Academy's 28th class, a longtime tactics instructor at the infantry school in Chiba, and, in July 1937, the battalion commander whose actions at the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing helped ignite full-scale war between Japan and China. In the 5 years since, he had watched a single doctrine vindicated on battlefield after battlefield. China fallen, Malaya fallen, Singapore fallen, the Philippines fallen, armies twice the size of the attacking Japanese forces surrendering outright. Spirit defeats matter. The bayonet defeats the machine gun. Ichiki had been slated to lead the ground assault on Midway, before the Japanese Navy's catastrophic defeat there canceled the entire operation. Now, reading the Rabaul cable, he had his chance to test the doctrine against Americans directly. His orders? Take roughly 900 men, the elite advance element of his regiment, land on Guadalcanal, retake the airfield, drive the Marines into the sea. The accompanying intelligence estimate put American strength on the island at around 2,000 men. It was wrong by a factor of more than 5, based on a single reconnaissance flight that had photographed empty beaches and empty roads, because the Marines were dug in, camouflaged, and invisible under a canopy of palm and mahogany, doing exactly what Marines are trained to do. Before he ever left Truk, Ichiki reportedly asked his briefing officers whether, after retaking Henderson Field, his 900 men could also retake Tulagi, a separate island defended by a full American regiment, reachable only by a 20-mile amphibious crossing with no air or naval support. The Japanese had a name for the mindset behind that question: Shoribyo, victory disease. The conviction that had settled over much of the officer corps since Pearl Harbor that Japanese soldiers were, by nature and training, simply superior to any Western enemy, and that intelligence, terrain, and numbers scarcely mattered next to spirit. I think it's worth pausing on that question about Tulagi for a moment, because it tells you almost everything about what was about to happen on that sandbar. This was not a reckless amateur. This was one of the more decorated and experienced infantry officers in the entire Imperial Army, and he was proposing an operation that on paper made no arithmetic sense at all, which is exactly the kind of failure that doesn't show up in pre-war planning documents, because the men making it are too confident to write their own doubts down. Here is the detail almost entirely missing from how this battle usually gets told, and it changes the whole picture of what happened that night. Vandegrift was not simply cautious, and the Marines were not simply lucky. On August 8th, an American signals intelligence unit in Hawaii, known as Station Hypo, intercepted and partially decoded a Japanese naval message linking Ichiki's unit to a specific destroyer squadron, feeding Vandegrift's headquarters advance warning that a Japanese landing force was already in motion toward the island, days before Ichiki's men ever set foot on the beach. The popular version of this story makes it sound as though a lone native scout's warning on the night of August 20th was the entire intelligence picture, and that scout's warning genuinely mattered, as you'll see. But American codebreakers had already cracked part of the picture from the other side of the Pacific. Fire discipline explains why the Marines held their fire that night. Codebreaking is a large part of why they were dug in, sighted, and ready days before that decision ever had to be made. The destroyers carrying the first element of Ichiki's regiment left Truk on the night of August 16th and put roughly 916 men ashore at Taivu Point, about 20 miles east of the American perimeter, on the night of August 18th, vanishing back into the dark before dawn. Ichiki chose not to wait for the remaining 1,200 men of his regiment, still 2 days behind him on slower transports. He gave his men a brief speech about the honor of the regiment and the certainty of victory, and the march west began at dawn. The creek they were marching toward carried, on Japanese maps, the name of the actual river at its mouth, the Ilu. American mapmakers had mislabeled it the Tenaru, after a different river miles further east, and the wrong name stuck. 20 miles away, 3 young Marines were digging a machine gun pit on the western bank of a tidal lagoon the men called Alligator Creek, though there are no alligators anywhere in the Solomon Islands. Only saltwater crocodiles the Marines had never seen before and had no name for. The gun commander was Corporal Leroy Diamond, 23, from Brooklyn. The gunner was Private First Class Johnny Rivers, 22, a Native American Marine from rural Pennsylvania who could strip a Browning blindfolded. The third man was Private Albert Schmid, 21, born in the Burholm section of Philadelphia, an apprentice steel burner at the Dodge Steel Company before the war, engaged to a Sears department store clerk named Ruth Hartley, Babs to everyone who knew her, whom he had proposed to on a train platform the day after he enlisted. None of the 3 had ever fired at another human being. They finished their pit before sunset, laid the barrel of the water-cooled Browning on its tripod pointing east across the creek, and settled in. They did not know that Colonel Ichiki, at that exact hour, was less than 15 miles away, walking straight toward them. The night before, patrols along the eastern edge of the Marine perimeter had already begun reporting movement in the tree line. A native scout who had seen strange men on the coastal trail, but couldn't say how many or how close. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock, commanding 2nd Battalion 1st Marines, doubled the watch and told his company commanders to be ready. He would not fully understand what was coming until a man staggered into his command post late on August 20th with his throat slashed open, one arm sliced through, and his mouth full of blood. That man's name was Jacob Vuza, and the version of his story that made it into American newspapers and into decades of retelling afterward is, in its broad strokes, extraordinary and true, but not, according to more recent research drawing on Vuza's own family and on the coast watcher Martin Clemens's own account, quite the story most documentaries repeat. Clemens himself deserves a sentence here because without him, the whole intelligence picture on the ground falls apart. A 27-year-old former British colonial district officer, he had been living in the hills above the coast for weeks by that point, radioing Japanese ship movements back to Australia and building a network of native scouts, Vuza among them, who knew the island's jungle paths better than any Japanese officer ever would. The popular telling has Vuza captured on a solo scouting patrol, tortured for information he never gave, left for dead tied to a tree, and then somehow sprinting 11 miles through jungle in the dark to reach the American line just in time. The more carefully sourced version is grimmer and, if anything, more remarkable. Vuza appears to have been captured and then forced to guide the Japanese patrol closer to the American positions before Marine outposts opened fire and the group scattered. And it was only in the chaos after that contact that his Japanese captors bayoneted him and left him for dead. Either way, the essential fact does not change. A 50-year-old retired policeman from the Solomon Islands Constabulary, carrying nothing but a small silk American flag a Marine had given him days earlier as thanks for rescuing a downed Navy pilot, endured hours of interrogation and repeated bayonet wounds, arms, shoulder, face, stomach, finally the throat, without giving up a single detail about American positions, strength, or headquarters locations. With his hands bound behind him and his throat cut too badly to make a sound, he worked the rope against his teeth and the bark of the tree for hours, using his own blood and saliva to soften the fibers, until his hands came free and he could begin dragging himself toward the American line. He reached Pollock's command post that night having lost, by later medical estimate, close to half the blood in his body, and gave his report. Japanese soldiers in strength coming from the east that same night before he collapsed. He would receive 16 pints of blood over the following 12 days. He lived. What Pollock did with that warning was not dramatic. It was the same lesson Vandergrift's headquarters had already been acting on since Station Hypo's intercept days earlier. Hold your fire, let them close, and let the interlocking machine guns and the canister rounds do what they were positioned to do. The terrain helped. The sandbar across the mouth of the lagoon ran barely 25 to 30 meters wide at low tide, the only crossing point, which meant every attacker had to funnel through a strip of open sand the Marines had already sighted from both flanks with what infantry manuals call interlocking fire, each machine gun firing diagonally across the front of the position beside it, so anything on the sandbar sat in two guns' crossfire at once. Behind the machine guns sat 37mm guns, loaded not with armor-piercing rounds, but canister shot, roughly 120 steel balls sprayed in a widening cone, wide enough at 50 meters to sweep the entire sandbar. Behind those sat 81mm mortars, and behind the mortars, 2 miles inland, sat the 75mm howitzers of the 11th Marines. The Marines were not defending a beach. They had built a killing ground, and Ichiki was about to walk his men into the center of it. Japanese mortar and machine gun fire opened around 1:30 in the morning, aimed less to kill than to draw an American response and expose Marine positions. The Marines did not take the bait. Sometime between 3 and 3:10, a flare burst green over the sandbar, and roughly 100 Japanese soldiers came out of the tree line at a dead run, screaming, some of it in broken English, "Marine, you die tonight!" They crossed 60 meters, 50, 40. At 30, the entire Marine line opened up at once. Every machine gun, every canister gun, every rifleman with a clear shot. Survivors described the sandbar simply disappearing into a haze of steam and flying sand, and when it cleared, the men who had been running were no longer running. They lay piled 3 and 4 deep in places where the canister shot had caught them. A handful, a dozen, perhaps 15, made it across into the first row of foxholes, and for 20 brutal minutes Marines and the Japanese soldiers who had broken through fought with bayonets, entrenching tools, rifle butts, and fists in a stretch of ground no larger than a suburban backyard, before the last of them died with an entrenching tool to the base of the skull. In the machine gun pit 50 yards south of the sandbar, Rivers opened fire the moment the flare went up, Schmid feeding belts of ammunition, Diamond on his knees calling targets. Rivers fired burst after burst into the Japanese flank, until a single round, its origin never identified, came across the water and killed him instantly. Schmid slid into his place behind the gun he had trained on but never fired in combat. He held the trigger down in 3 and 4 second bursts for the next hour as wave after wave came across the sand, Diamond slapping his shoulder left or right to redirect his fire onto new targets neither of them could clearly see in the dark. At some point, a Japanese round punched through the Browning's water jacket, the metal sleeve that kept the barrel from overheating, and the coolant drained onto Schmid's lap, first warm, then near boiling, while the barrel itself began to glow dull red and then bright red, past the point at which the manual said the gun should have seized entirely. It did not seize. Schmid kept it alive by shortening his bursts and letting the barrel cool between them, praying it would hold for one more belt. Diamond, hit in the arm, refused to leave the pit and kept slapping Schmid's shoulders with his good hand. Behind Japanese lines, a staff officer named Yoshimi Sawada had come forward to see the second wave collapse into the same wall of fire that had shredded the first, and went looking for the assault's battalion commander to beg him to abandon the frontal approach entirely and find a crossing upstream, away from the sandbar. The battalion commander refused, insisted on seeing the ground himself, walked out onto the sand in the gray pre-dawn light, and was killed along with his adjutant within 3 steps. Sawada carried the report to Ichiki directly. The frontal assault could not succeed. Men were being annihilated. Ichiki asked one question: how many enemy machine guns? And when Sawada admitted he didn't know, gave the only order his doctrine allowed him to give: continue the attack. Sometime near 4 in the morning, a Japanese soldier crawled to within about 15 meters of Schmid and Diamond's pit and threw a fragmentation grenade that landed roughly a foot from Schmid's leg. It detonated before either man could move. Fragments tore into Schmid's right hand, forearm, shoulder, and face. 2 fragments went into his eyes. His right eye was destroyed instantly. His left would never see again either. Albert Schmid, 21 years old, a steelworker from Philadelphia who had joined the Marine Corps the day after Pearl Harbor, specifically so he could come home and marry Ruth Hartley, went permanently blind in that instant. He did not leave the gun. He could not see the sandbar or the tracers anymore, but he could still feel Diamond's hand on his shoulder. Left, right, left, right. And he could still feel the trigger under his finger. And for another hour, he kept firing anyway. Around 5 in the morning, Ichiki committed his last reserve. A company ordered into the shallow surf to wade west along the shoreline and flank the Marine line where the machine guns couldn't traverse to reach them. The howitzers of the 11th Marines, 2 miles inland, had already been ranged onto that stretch of water and opened fire the moment the flanking company was waist deep. A 75mm shell detonating in shallow salt water throws a column of foam 30 feet into the air and kills everything within 20 meters of the burst. Marines watching from shore said the sea itself turned pink. By 6, the assault had broken entirely, and the survivors who could still run scattered back toward the coconut grove on the eastern bank, hoping to reach the jungle before daylight exposed them. They did not get the chance. Vandegrift, monitoring the entire fight from his command post 3 miles west, gave the order to close the trap rather than simply let the survivors flee. Colonel Clifton Cates, commanding 1st Marines, moved a battalion around the position's southern flank, crossed the creek upstream, and swung east along the coast to seal the retreat before the Japanese survivors could reach it. The counterattack that closed out the fighting that morning deserves its own honest accounting, because the 4 M3 Stuart light tanks Vandegrift sent across the sandbar at 7 o'clock did not fight a battle so much as clear a field. Each carried a 37mm gun and 2 machine guns, and they picked their way through the piled dead with what one witness called a strange, deliberate slowness, the way a man walks through a graveyard at dusk, before rolling into the coconut grove where survivors of Ichiki's shattered command had gone to ground, most wounded, some out of ammunition, a handful still trying to organize resistance from behind fallen palm trunks. The tanks fired into anything that looked like a firing position, and where the treads met men on the ground who had not moved out of the way in time, did not stop or steer around them. An officer who walked the ground behind the tanks that morning used the phrase a meat grinder, and it is the only honest word for what he saw. I don't think an honest telling of this battle gets to skip that part simply because the Marines were the ones who won. Marines that same morning also learned, at a cost, that some wounded Japanese soldiers held onto grenades or pistols and detonated them at close range rather than surrender, a lesson that hardened within hours into an unwritten rule that would carry all the way through Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Do not assume a man on the ground is no longer dangerous. By midday the counting began, and it took 3 days. Between 774 and 800 of Ichiki's original 916 men were dead. 15 were taken prisoner, most unconscious when captured. Roughly 128 escaped east toward Taivu Point, where they radioed Rabaul that the detachment had been almost annihilated short of the airfield. A message the officers of 17th Army initially refused to believe, cabling back twice to ask whether it had been garbled in transmission, because a regiment of the Imperial Japanese Army being nearly wiped out in a single night by a defensive line of United States Marines did not fit anything the war had shown them so far. Lieutenant Colonel Hiroshi Matsumoto, the staff officer who had personally briefed Ichiki on Truk days earlier and knew him well, reportedly told his own superiors at 17th Army headquarters that it simply could not be true, that a veteran commander of Ichiki's caliber could not have lost his entire command that fast. American losses stood at 41 killed and 71 wounded, an exchange ratio near 20-1. Colonel Ichiki himself died sometime in the battle's last hour, and the 2 accounts of exactly how, a Japanese version in which he burned his regimental colors and took his own life by ritual disembowelment after recognizing the attack had failed, and an American version in which he was simply killed by machine gun fire near his forward post, have never been reconciled, and probably never will be. I want to say something here about why this particular battle, small by the standards of what followed across the rest of the Pacific War, mattered as much as it did. It was the first time in the 8 months since Pearl Harbor that an American ground force had met a Japanese ground force in a set engagement and won a clear, unambiguous victory. Not slowed them, not delayed them, beaten them, at a ratio of roughly 20 Japanese dead for every American lost. The myth of an invincible Japanese soldier, a natural night fighter who did not know how to lose, effectively died on that sandbar in about 4 hours. Imperial General Headquarters spent much of the rest of the war refusing to fully absorb that lesson. 3 weeks later, a Japanese brigade nearly 3 times the size of Ichiki's force, under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, attacked a low ridge south of Henderson Field, defended by Merritt Edson's raiders and parachutists, in a battle that came to bear Edson's name. Better planned, coming from 3 directions at once with far more artillery support, and it still failed, at a cost of several hundred more Japanese dead against a few dozen American losses, for essentially the same underlying reason. Attacking prepared American positions frontally, at night, on a doctrine that assumed spirit would compensate for firepower, kept producing the same arithmetic regardless of how much more carefully the follow-up assaults were planned. Nearly 2 years after that, on Saipan, the same doctrine that had sent Ichiki's men across that sandbar sent over 4,000 Japanese soldiers into the largest banzai charge of the entire war, many of them armed with little more than bayonets and sharpened bamboo, on the morning of July 7, 1944. The Marine Corps, by contrast, absorbed the lesson of Alligator Creek almost immediately, and the doctrine of dug-in, mutually supporting positions with interlocking automatic weapons and pre-registered artillery became close to standard practice for every island landing that followed, from Tarawa through Peleliu to Okinawa. The men involved scattered, as men from every war eventually do, into the rest of their lives, and I think what happened to each of them afterward is worth knowing, because the battle didn't end when the shooting stopped. Jacob Vuza recovered fully enough after his 16 pints of blood to walk out of the hospital tent on his own feet less than 2 weeks later, and went straight back to scouting duty, serving that November as Chief Native Scout for the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion's month-long Long Patrol behind Japanese lines. He received the Silver Star and Legion of Merit from the United States, the George Medal from Britain, and eventually the Order of the British Empire. Queen Elizabeth II knighted him in 1979, making him Sir Jacob Vuza, and the U.S. Marine Corps separately made him an honorary sergeant major. He died in his home village on Guadalcanal in March 1984, in his early 90s, and his memorial in Honiara today reads simply, Friend of the Marines. Al Schmidt was flown home permanently blind, and by his own account fully expected Ruth Hartley to break off their engagement rather than marry a man who would never see her. He dictated a letter to a nurse telling her exactly that. She met him at the train station anyway, and married him in April 1943. Their son, Albert Jr., was born the following year. The Navy Cross citation credited him with continuing to man his machine gun after being blinded. Roger Butterfield's 1944 book about him became a bestseller, and Warner Brothers turned it into Pride of the Marines in 1945, with John Garfield playing Schmid and Eleanor Parker playing Ruth. The combat sequence itself runs barely 10 minutes of a 2-hour film. What made the picture genuinely unusual for its moment, and what I think is worth noting on its own, is that most of its running time is spent on Schmid's bitter, halting readjustment to blindness back home, his refusal to learn basic skills, his anger at being pitied, a hospital ward scene written by the screenwriter Albert Maltz, later blacklisted during the post-war Red Scare, in which wounded veterans argue openly about whether the country they're coming home to actually deserves what they gave it. In 1945, a major studio release built around a war hero's psychological unraveling rather than his heroism was still close to unheard of. It arrived a year before The Best Years of Our Lives made that kind of story mainstream, and it did so using a man's real name and real face rather than a fictional composite. For a few years afterward, Al Schmidt was one of the most famous enlisted men in America. Fame faded the way it does. He worked afterward as a parts assembler, eventually moved to Florida, and by every account that survives, sat alone in a chair every year on the anniversary of that night and did not speak to anyone until morning. He died in December 1982, 62 years old. Corporal Leroy Diamond survived the war, went home to Brooklyn, and by most accounts lived a long, deliberately quiet life, giving few interviews about that night for the rest of it. Johnny Rivers is buried in a military cemetery. His name rarely appears outside specialist histories of the battle. There is no film about him, no book. One Marine who had fought nearby wrote, decades later, a single sentence about the difference between how Schmid and Rivers were remembered that has stayed with me since I first read it. America wanted a hero, fast, a live one. I don't think that line is only about 1942. It's worth asking yourself, how much of what any of us remember about any war comes down to who survived to tell it and who didn't? Guadalcanal itself ground on for another 5 months after that single night, through Bloody Ridge and the Matanakaw and the Great Japanese Offensive of October, before the island was finally declared secure in February 1943. Vandegrift received the Medal of Honor for the campaign, rose to 4 stars, and served as the 18th Commandant of the Marine Corps from 1944 to 1947, dying in 1973 with his memoirs still in print today. Colonel Cates, who had closed the trap on Ichiki survivors, later commanded the 4th Marine Division at Tinian and Iwo Jima and became the 19th Commandant himself in 1948. Lieutenant Colonel Pollock, whose decision to hold fire on the sandbar that night arguably did more to shape the battle's outcome than any single weapon involved, finished the war as a colonel, served in later Pacific campaigns, and eventually retired a lieutenant general, a career that, like so much of this story, never generated anywhere near the public recognition of the men whose names ended up on movie posters. None of that changes what happened on the sandbar at Alligator Creek in those 4 hours before dawn, or why it mattered as much as it did to everything that came after it. If a relative of yours served anywhere in the Pacific, Guadalcanal, or any island that came after it, I'd like to hear, in the comments, whatever they were willing to tell you about it. Because for most of these men, most of what happened in the dark on nights like that one was never spoken of again.